Okay, welcome back, everyone. I view people who are able to go through the gardens on a beautiful February day in Southern California and come back here for an afternoon session as the faithful remnant. So you are the faithful remnant, and I think you will be well rewarded because this afternoon is a really fantastic group of papers, and I think it will engender a lot of conversation at the end. So all those scofflaws who just blew us off this afternoon, it's their loss. Oh, right. Okay. Oh, yes. Okay, you've got a better view of human nature than I do. Okay, good. All right. So this afternoon's panel or session is called Photographic Evidence with a question mark at the end, and I love that question mark. Let's hold on to that. And our first panelist is someone who I know well from her work, her very impressive work here at the Huntington, Martha A. Sandweiss. Martha Sandweiss is a historian of the United States with particular interest in the history of the American West, visual culture, and public history. She received her PhD from Yale University and began her career as a photography curator at the Amon Carter Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. She taught American Studies and History at Amherst College for 20 years before joining the Princeton faculty in 2009. Sandweiss is the author or editor of numerous books on American history and photography, and I commend them all to you. But her most recent include the astonishing 2009 book, Passing Strange, a Gilded Age tale of love and deception across the color line, about famed explorer Clarence King, which was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in History and the National Book Critics Circle Award in Biography. And Martha also teaches narrative writing at Princeton, and I commend this book to you because it is so beautifully written. It's a great model for how to write really compelling historical work for a public audience. Her 2002 book, Print the Legend, Photography in the American West, won the Organization of American Historians Ray Allen Billington Award for the Best Book in American Frontier History and the William P. Clements Award. She's currently working on a book dedicated to a single photograph. I thought of you, Paul, when you mentioned yesterday about users. She's working on a book dedicated to a single photograph taken by Alexander Gardner on the American frontier in 1868. Marnie participated in the fourth conference in this photo archive series, which took place in Florence, Italy in 2011. Her paper titled Photography, the Archive, and the Invention of the American West appears in the subsequent volume edited by Costanza Carafa and Tiziana Serena. This afternoon, Marnie will talk about the promises and challenges for those of us who rely on the photograph as a primary source document in the face of this kind of wholesale digitization of photographic archives, in a paper entitled The Photograph as Historical Evidence in the Digital Age. Please warmly welcome Marnie Sandweiss.
Thank you to all of my colleagues for bringing me here to Southern California. It's really astonishing to discover that so many other eccentric people care about archives, and how wonderful to discover that we're a community. I've worn many hats over the course of my career. I've been a photography curator, I've been an art museum director, I've been a professor. And this afternoon, I really want to speak as an historian, as I address the opportunities and challenges that I see arising from the increasing prevalence and power of digital photo archives. And I want to speak not from the perspective of someone who writes about the history of archives or the shifting theoretical perspectives on archival practices, but on what they mean, but I want to speak really as a user. Now, in the beginning, let me make my biases clear. I'm a historian who does care about the materiality of images, about the broader social and cultural contexts in which they're created, about the ways in which they flow through the marketplace. I value photographs as primary source documents. The visual content of the photograph matters to me, but it is not everything, as it might be to, say, an architectural historian who wants to know what a particular cornice looks like before they renovate a building. For me, it is the material object that matters most. Now, I know that such interests distinguish me from many other historians. Most of my colleagues think of photographs as disembodied images, rather than as time-bound physical artifacts. They focus on the visual information conveyed by the content of the image, rather than the photograph as a physical object with an embedded history of its own. They rely on photographs as illustrations, mere adjuncts to arguments already developed from their study of other sorts of texts, rather than thinking of them as rich primary sources that can yield evidence, much as literary sources can. Now, I want to argue this afternoon that the turn to the digital reinforces what I consider to be these bad habits. When digital archives transform material objects into evanescent images, they destroy much of the rich material evidence embedded in a physical photograph. And they make it that much harder for me to persuade my historian colleagues that they ought to take photographs seriously as source material for their research. Now, how does one do that anyway? What does it mean to think about photographs as primary source documents for historical research? And what particular challenges do digital archives pose for someone interested in using photographs in that way? Many of my colleagues in the last 2 days have approached these questions and used different terms to frame these challenges, but I'll just put it this way. For me, any analysis of photographs as primary historical sources needs to consider photographs as they exist in history and through history. Now, to consider a photograph in history, we might ask about patronage and think about the very specific physical and temporal circumstances under which that photograph was produced. We might consider the tension between the photographer's needs and the subject's ambitions, seek out the original format of the image and the way in which it moved into the public realm, and look for evidence of viewers' response. Reinserted into the world of its production, the photograph is so much more than a visual record of material fact. It becomes a tool for understanding larger questions about economic ambition, patronage, the circulation of information, the marketplace of ideas. Now, to consider that photograph through history, however, without the ties that once bound it to a particular moment, we'd have to ask about its uses and how its uses and meanings have changed over time, how it moved from one owner to another or into an archive. We'd think about how our encounter with the photograph is shaped by our own research agenda. Photographs may be fixed physical objects, but their meanings can change as viewers approach them with fresh questions. When we look at the young Barack Obama, we cannot help but search for the signs of the man he will become. When we look at a 1990s photograph of the lower Manhattan skyline, we cannot help but ache for the loss of those towers destroyed on September 11th, 2001. Our readings may be informed by our understanding of historical events that transpired after the making of the images, by an instinctive empathy or sympathy or dislike for the subject, by experiences that have unfolded in our own lives. These are the very things that condition our readings of literary documents too, of course. And the differences between our responses to an image and the responses of original audiences, I think, matter. The very disjuncture can help us understand a photograph in new and useful ways and open our eyes to larger historical questions. Now, we spoke yesterday and a bit this morning about the idea of photographs as evidence. But what is evidence? An object or a photograph is not, I would argue, intrinsically evidence, unless someone asks of it a particular question. Sometimes a blue dress is just a blue dress. But when you ask different questions, sometimes a blue dress is evidence. You know what I'm talking about. Now, it goes without saying that the digitization of older archives of photographs now gives us access to an extraordinary number of images. I am an archive rat, so you might expect me to be standing before you as a happy person. It's not that I haven't enjoyed my trips to Juneau, Missoula, Tacoma, Lincoln. Certainly, I've enjoyed my research trips here to the Huntington. But the digital turn, of course, lets me work from home, allows me to search enormous archives, compare images from different sources, zoom in on details, download study prints, find images for my lectures. I'm not a Luddite. But when I find myself contemplating the digital turn, I sometimes find myself despairing. Why? I think the evolving digital environment poses deep challenges for all of us who work with photographs. And I want to focus in my brief remarks this afternoon on 4 main areas. One is the challenges inherent in the transformation of older analog photographs into digital form. 2, the challenges occasioned by what we call born digital images. 3, the challenges posed by the organizational and intellectual structures of digital archives. And 4, and finally, the challenges created by the emerging and consolidating power of commercial digital archives, which we've not yet discussed these last few days. The interests of these archives, I want to argue, are simply not the same as those archives administered by, say, the Huntington Library or the Library of Congress. So let me briefly address these one by one, starting with the issues raised by the practice of digitizing older photographs, originally on copper, on tin, on glass, or on paper. As so many speakers have already noted, it is a process of translation. That goes without saying. And as with most translation processes, something often gets lost. Not with every archive, but with many. And you've surely had this experience. The digital copy doesn't show the edges of the physical photographic object, so you can't be sure you see the entire image or tell what sort of mount it's on. It doesn't show the back of the object, so you can't see what previous users or producers may have scribbled on the back of it. In most cases, the existence of that digital copy doesn't prevent you from going somewhere to consult the original. But for most researchers, of course, the digital copy becomes the thing. And the original, with all that physical information, gets lost. Now, many historians fail to grasp just what that physical information could show them. For them, the digital copy is as good as the physical original. And this often stems, I think, from a kind of visual illiteracy and an anxiety on the part of those historians about their inability to understand the historical modes of production that produced photographic prints. But dismissing the original is, of course, a huge mistake. One doesn't need a deep understanding of photographic chemistry to analyze a photograph as a historical document. It's enough to understand that prevailing photographic technologies determined what could be photographed, what the photograph would look like, how it could be published or exhibited, how much it would cost, and how it would circulate. So an historian of 1840s America, for example, needs to understand that most photographs, daguerreotypes that is, were made inside of studios because the daguerreotype technology made landscape photography both difficult in terms of as a physical challenge and an economic risk. Similarly, a Civil War historian does need to understand that the relatively slow exposure times demanded by the prevailing wet plate technology, coupled with the bulkiness of the necessary apparatus, made it impossible to capture images of action. But that same wet plate negative process they need to understand let photographers make and distribute large numbers of paper prints, something that would have been impossible 15 years before. An historian of Gilded Age America needs to know that the invention of the Kodak camera in 1888 simplified picture making, and that this had many consequences. Amateur photography takes off. Many more women become involved in the process of documenting their own lives. And an historian of the Depression era or the World War II should understand how the developments in halftone printing technologies allowed picture magazines to emerge as important vehicles for the transmission of images. These are important concepts to grasp. But the rise of digital archives has begun to obscure even this most basic sort of information. In privileging visual content over the careful documentation of physical form, many archives are losing or destroying key evidence in the headlong rush to the digital. And their digital simulacra make the daguerreotyped object look like the subject of an albumin print, look like the subject of a snapshot. And as the identifying information for the source images is destroyed, information of central importance to the historian is lost. Consider this example from the Corbis archive. I'm going to show you here 3 images of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. In each case, if you look carefully, well, you can see there, you can see identifying information about the photographer. So image 1, image 2, image 3. In each case, the photographer's name actually is visible on the images to anyone who looks closely enough. But in each case, it is simply erased by the metadata that you see on the right. So a viewer or user is asked to understand this image as an image by Corbis, not Pillsbury or William somebody or Bear. And just like that, so many possibilities for thoughtful research are erased. Now, slightly different issues get raised by the advent of born digital photographs, that is, photographs originally created with digital technology as opposed to digitized copies of older photographs. Certainly, photography has hardly been a static medium, and the recent emergence of digital images echoes, I think, in some ways, the transformation that happened in the late 1850s and 1860s, when the singular media of the daguerreotype, tintype, and ambrotype gave way to glass negatives that could be used to make untold numbers of paper prints. Suddenly, in both cases, large quantities of photographs could circulate around the globe far beyond the control of their makers. In a sense, that historical moment of the 1860s prefigures our turn to the digital. But as objects of historical inquiry, born digital images do raise particular problems of their own. In part, because there are just so many. Born digital images constitute virtually all of the images being made today. The first digital cameras shipped out to consumers in 1997, the first cell phone cameras in the year 2000. And click, just like that, we were drowning in images. The year 2000, the year that marked their peak, an estimated 85 billion analog photographs got made around the globe, mostly, researchers tell me, of babies. But by 2011, an estimated 2.5 billion people owned digital cameras, and the Facebook photo collection included roughly 140 billion photographs. That was more than 10,000 times the number of photographs in the Library of Congress. As one researcher noted, every 2 minutes, people were taking as many photographs as the whole of humanity took in the 19th century. Now, even presuming we can gain access to some meaningful percentage of digital images through online archives or social media sites, how can we, as historians, use them as primary sources for scholarly research? The sheer number of images really is a challenge. How ought we to frame differently our questions about authorial intent when a photographer who used to make 5 photographs of a subject can now make 1,000 in virtually the same amount of time? How can we distinguish the typical from the unusual? That's actually an important question for an historian. How can we locate the data that identifies the image or allows us to assess its utility as an historical document? How can we identify its maker? I want to address these questions in a moment when I turn to a few thoughts about digital archives themselves. But first, a final big question about all those digital images. How do we assess their integrity? Again, this is a question that comes from my profession, that of the historian. Photographers have always edited their scenes through the simple act of framing their pictures, by exposing their images at a particular moment instead of a moment earlier or later. And they've always had the ability to alter those images through retouching, double exposures, artful editing in the darkroom. Still, in the pre-digital era, the subject of a photograph generally did once appear before a camera lens, and we cannot make that assumption anymore. How many of us really have the technical skills to detect whether an image has been digitally altered or even created in a computer? With digital photography, there's no easily accessed equivalent of the original negative that allows us to assess the photographer's alterations or the relationship between an image and an actual event. There's no easily certified original that one can examine for marks of use or age or alteration. For historians used to evaluating the legitimacy of their evidence, that's a problem. It's actually a huge problem, or at least it should be. Now let me turn to my third set of concerns about the form and structure of digital archives. You all know that the quality of digital archives varies widely. Some are the electronic equivalent of a disorganized drawer of photographs dumped out on the table. Garbage in, garbage out. Well-cataloged archives of historical photographs are more likely to become well-cataloged digital collections, but not always. Now, many digital archives make it difficult to determine just what sort of physical object is actually in the collection. Is it a negative? Is it a vintage print? Is it a copy print? Some obscure the name of the photographer or make it difficult to determine the size of the original object, both vital bits of information for someone who wants to think about how photographs circulated or what sort of impact the images might have had. Most reproduce the image, but many don't reproduce the mount or the back of the photograph, which of course contains crucial evidence for a historian. And as I said before, digitization can flatten out the difference among photographic prints and conceal or erase information accessible to people who consult the original. Digitization can erase all marks of wear and use. Now, the quality of digital visual archives varies widely, and let me just give you a few almost random examples. Consider the way that Dorothea Lange's photograph, known as Migrant Mother, is presented on the website of the Library of Congress, where the image was deposited in the 1930s because it was done for a federally funded project, and where the intellectual rights to its use have always been in the public domain. Just going to show you 3 screenshots. I wasn't adept enough to get this all onto one slide, to convey to you a sense of the vast amount of information that's really here. There's careful information about the size of the original object, the evidence of retouching. We get information here about the original caption. But then look at how this image is presented on Corbis, which actually charges a double space rate for this as a premium image, which in fact anybody could go to the Library of Congress site and get for free. And please note that in a variant view of this image, Corbis omits Lange's name entirely. Now it's simply a picture from the Bettman archives. Now, if we're being generous, we can just call this a sloppy archive. I looked up some images of Clarence King, a man about whom I've written a book, and I found 2 versions here of the same image. A portrait of geologist Clarence King, and, inexplicably, a portrait of 4 geologists. It's hard to explain that one. And in any case, neither of these captions explain to you that this is an image of 1882, taken from a book published in 1904, and one that depicts King dressed up to illustrate a story. Or look on Corbis at this image. I did a search on Corbis for Carleton Watkins, the great California photographer, and if you can read the URL at the top, you can see I searched for Watkins. But again, if you look for at the metadata, on the right of the image, Watkins' name has been completely erased. Now, Corbis is not the only digital archive to change how we encounter images, of course. You can look for life images through Google Pictures, and I actually had the occasion many years ago to talk to Peter Stackpole, the photographer who made this image, and I can assure you that he never thought the salient fact about his image was its size in pixels. But that's the catalog information you get now when you go to this site. Now, certainly we can cite examples of much better, more useful digital archives, and as a grateful guest, I will just show you examples from the Huntington, showing you how they've documented a Carleton Watkins stereo, carefully showing the entire mount, showing the verso and recto, and adding additional curatorial information. But I think we need to stop right here and ask this question. What would compel commercial archives to follow the best practices developed by library or museum archives? To my mind, nothing. Their users simply don't care. There is no financial incentive for them to do the hard work that curators and archivists do every day. The future, I really fear, may lie with the Corbis model, not with the Huntingtons. Now, it can be very difficult to determine how digital archives have been created. Researchers who go to a physical archive don't always know how or when material came into the collection. That's hard, I admit that. But if you go to a physical archive and you have the patience to plow through boxes and boxes of photographs, you can generally get a sense of how much of the archive you have seen. I know there's stuff in the basement, but let's not talk about that. Visitors to a digital archive are actually very hard-pressed to understand the relationship between what's online and what's in the real or figurative file drawers. Did a curator digitize everything? Only the most requested images? The images needed for a local school project? The most fragile pictures? Indeed, did the curator even make those decisions in the first place? Or was it a summer intern picking all the pictures that fit in a scanner? Or an advertiser willing to pay for the digitization of certain useful images? Digital archives tend to erase all signs of their own creation. They convey the illusion of providing researchers with everything, with access to everything, but they rarely do. In general, the quirky nature of digital archives and the uneven quality of the metadata appended to individual digital image files pushes the casual researcher towards a greater focus on visual information and away from the serious consideration of a photograph as a material object capable of conveying more complex and nuanced sorts of historical information. There are enormous benefits to having access to so much visual data. But my central point is this: those benefits come at a price. Now, certainly the integrity of a digital archive is not fixed at the moment it's created. It can be improved as cataloging standards change, as institutional priorities shift, as financial resources become available. And over the years, I've certainly watched the Library of Congress's website and the website of many other digital archives become increasingly scholarly and excellent. But the integrity of a digital archive can also shift as ownership changes. And that leads me to my final point about the challenges posed by the increasing consolidation and commercialization of image archives. Now, we all know that physical collections can move. Time Life recently announced the transfer of its archive to the New York Historical Society. We all know that family or library or local historical societies archives can move or get sold when local resources can no longer retain them. We talked a bit over the last few days about the idea of the intentionality of collectors, and certainly that was a theme this morning. And at the Q&A session, I hope we can talk about how we can preserve the intentionality of that Palestinian collector or Mrs. Gardner or whatever when those collections become part of larger institutional archives. How do we preserve that? Now, digital archives can also move. And of course, here it's a word that has an entirely different meaning. Think about how they move. They move with passwords and they move with money. They do not move with moving trucks or acid-free boxes. And I think this hints at the problem. They move to people with more money or the most ambitious money-making schemes, often not to those invested in researching the content or preserving physical artifacts. So let me illustrate my point about the potential issues that can arise from this by speaking very briefly about the January 2016 sale by Corbis, the image licensing company founded and owned by Bill Gates, of a large portion of its photo stock to a Chinese company called Visual China Group. Visual China Group acquired the rights to distribute their images within China, and Getty Images, no connection to our generous host, the Getty Research Institute, will distribute Corbis images outside of China. Now, if we've already talked about the intellectual sloppiness and carelessness with which commercial archives like Corbis can be constructed, we now also have to talk about censorship. The possibility that an archive will present two different faces to two different users, that an archive can selectively manipulate how information can be used, and that how it can do that without our knowledge. Now, I'll confess that a CNN story sent me back to my computer to check this out. If you type the words Tiananmen Square into the Corbis search engine, you get what you see here, the familiar images of the uprising in 1989. But if you type in what the internet tells me are the Chinese characters for the words Tiananmen Square, inexplicably you get photographs of celebrities and movie stars. I have no idea. Now, I know that the protest photographs were inaccessible in China before the sale to Corbis. I've worked in China. I understand about the Great Chinese Firewall, as they call it. But I want to explain to you, these are results I got in Princeton, New Jersey, using a laptop owned by Princeton University that has a Princeton-owned IP address on it. This is not censorship that's being controlled by national boundaries. It's a kind of censorship now taking place within our own country that's dependent upon language. So I want to make the point that all large visual archives reach viewers through mediated search engines, and all of these search engines are subject to censorship and control. Large commercial digital archives do not operate with the best interests of the historian researcher at heart. They are built to be money-making operations, and they are not immune to political pressures. Now, I appreciate the considerable advantages of the digital turn for both photographic archives and the creation of new photographs. But in closing, I just want to reiterate that the emphasis on visual information comes at the expense of all the smaller details that have made analog photographs such rich sources of historical knowledge. No, historians have not always been very smart about how they've used photographs as historical sources, but some of them, at least, did figure out smart ways to interrogate physical objects as forms of material culture, and likewise found in older forms of photography the corroborating details, the fresh perspectives, and sparks of human empathy that let them write about the past in a more understanding way. Whether born digital photographs can ever provide equally compelling and verifiable evidence about people or places or events distant in time and space is, I think, very much up in the air. And digital archives, especially the commercial ones, pose what I think are huge impediments to serious historical research. How can we even know who made the photograph? Historians do sometimes have to turn to anonymous sources, an unsigned letter, an unattributed newspaper story, a fragment of a larger document. But what kind of historical evidence is a pixelated image whose creator we can't identify, whose original physical form we can't discern, whose integrity we can't confirm, and whose purpose we can't figure out? What kind of source is an archive whose scope we can't determine, whose structure we can't see, whose political and economic ambitions are concealed from view? I used to think that if I wrote enough books, or gave enough talks, or taught enough seminars, I could persuade my fellow historians to take historical photographs seriously as rich primary sources for broad and complex questions about the past. But I think I've probably lost the fight. With the turn to the digital, material objects really have become nothing more than disembodied images, the simplest kind of visual information. And in the end, I suppose it's me that's become the historical artifact that might need explaining. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marnie, for that excellent talk. It's really, I see it sort of more as a call to arms almost, and I don't want to take up time asking lots of questions, but I will say that one of the things that I found most poignant about what you're talking about is, and it points up how much we're in the infancy. We were in the infancy of really this idea of visual literacy and of the whole study of the history of photography. And just as we were getting to be like walking, just toddlers, suddenly now we're, looking into the bottom of the coffin, and it feels like it's being put into the ground. So that, I think, is a compelling sort of thought. But I want to open up this because I know there will be a lot of people here who have things to say. A lot of people work in archives. I think this engendered a lot of interesting topics for conversation. So I will run around with a microphone. Please bring your questions, and I'll come up here. And we have about 10 minutes for questions, so just a few. And I think it would be good if you identify yourself if you work in an institution. So you got to out yourself.
Hello, I'm Emily Pugh. I work at the Getty Research Institute, and I'm trained as an art historian, and I agree with pretty much everything you said. But I wonder if what you're talking about is in part the need for more people to learn what art historians learn. in terms of being critical as they look at any kind of visual image, and thus that it's the digital is maybe exacerbating an existing problem rather than creating one. That is, there isn't enough visual literacy in any case, and now that there's all these digital images around, it's making that problem even more pronounced.
I think that's an excellent point, and it really builds on the point Jenny was just making, that we were just beginning to evolve a sort of series of best practices for thinking about how to do photographic history and how to deal with analog photographic archives when we got pushed into this. So I think you make an excellent point. It's not as if we had a very well-established set of best practices that we can now tweak. We didn't quite have them yet. So I think that makes the present situation much more difficult. I agree.
Jim Brust, independent historian and collector of photographs. I have a comment. Amen.
Thank you, Jim.
Paul.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I have 2 points. Rather than a question. One is there are frameworks in libraries and archives for recording the kind of information that you need and that in my world, landscapers, storytellers, and discoverers need in order to trust the content. But it's expensive, complex, time-consuming, and in many ways judgmental to apply the VRA core, for instance, to photographic material. So one of the problems you've identified is the lack of resources and intentionality on the part of curators and librarians and archivists and their support staff to find the resources to invest in the metadata. So some of the issues you're working on are solvable with the right kind of intent to solve the problems. An even bigger problem that you were alluding to on the commercial side, though, is aggregation. Outside of the organization. I'm working on a small grant to study digital humanities sources that are being aggregated like Nines and 18th Connect and additional. And the article I want to write is called Twice Removed. It's removed once in the digitization within a digital library and then removed again when these resources are aggregated in 10 million piles of 10 million things. So you're onto something. I'm not quite ready to give up yet in arguing for context being built into these, but with the Digital Public Library of America here and Europeana in Europe and the big digital humanities collections, there's a real risk that this contextual information that you need to trust the digital is we're not investing in it. So I think you're onto something.
Thank you for that comment.
Hi, my name's Charlie Holland. I'm working on a project with the Autry, but I've spent 10 years in the commercial photography business, so I know a lot about Corbis and Getty images. So I want to apologize for them on one hand. On the Paul's point is exactly right, that there is no standard within digital libraries of that kind because they have been eating up other collections for years and years and years. And the standard of information that you see on Corbis may well derive from the standard of information that someone in 1974 was asked to put onto a Bettman archive image. And the one thing that I think you may be being a little bit unfair about is that their intention was obvious from the beginning. Their intention was to make money.
Yeah.
So if a historian chooses to use that as a source, you're going to be disappointed from the get-go because you've misinterpreted the intention. The other thing is we can knock Corbis, shall we say. But Corbis are the only people that have paid millions and millions and millions of dollars to preserve their entire collection in the salt mines on Iron Mountain. They built they spent millions of dollars building customized caves that they took to 50 degrees, and 5 years later they took to 45 degrees, and they're way down now. They have done an exquisite job of maintaining the integrity of those originals. And also the other thing is I can't, because I don't have a computer in front of me, I have a feeling that that some of your frustration at finding information may come from the lack of agility in using their search engines. Because if that picture came up when you cited when you went for Carlton Watkins, that means Carlton Watkins is in the metadata. Mm-hmm. And often, like for Getty Images, certainly you can press, there's another place to go where all the keywords and all the information will come up. And I can't vouch for Corbis for that. But there are layers and layers of metadata, not because they want a historian to find it, because they want to make sure someone who wants to buy it will find it. So I think you might not be seeing all the information that is underneath those pictures, although yes, I agree, unforgivable to not put Bear photo when it's credited to Bear photo in the picture. Mm-hmm. So I'm sorry, that's my only comment.
You know, thank you for that comment, and you're probably right about my lack of agility on that website. Some of the material is behind a pay firewall, and I confess I did not pony up the money to go deeper into my image research there.
We're going to leave plenty of time for the panelists at the end. So could we all just thank Marnie right now so we can get into our next? Thank you, Marnie. Okay, next up is Jennifer Tucker. I've also had the great good fortune to have Jennifer work here at the Huntington on her various really interesting topics. Jennifer is a historian of modern Britain at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, where she teaches the history of science and technology and visual studies. From January through April 2016, she is a visiting fellow at the Birkbeck Institute for the Humanities, University of London. Jennifer's first book, Nature Exposed: Photography as Eyewitness in Victorian Science, which was published in 2006, explored the history of debates over photography and visual objectivity in Victorian science and popular culture. As a Fulbright Scholar in the history of art at the University of York in 2014, she conducted research for a recently completed second book titled Portrait of a Gentleman: The Great Tichborne Trial in the Victorian Visual Imagination. She is currently working on 2 new book-length projects. The first, Science Against Industry, traces the production and use of visual exhibits in 19th century British courtroom debates over air and river pollution. The second project, funded by a 2016 Public Scholar Award from the NEH, is called Caught on Camera and examines the history of facial recognition detection systems and their evasion. Today, Jennifer will reflect on her own and others' research experiences within a broad range of photographic archives in her paper entitled Accidental Archives: The Elusive Image in the Writing of History. Thank you, Jennifer.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction. And I want to start with thanks especially to the other participants and to those of you who are here this afternoon, and to the 3 institutions who host this event, and also to Costanza Carafa, Tracy Schuster, and Anne Blacksmith, and to Jennifer Watts. The British sociologist Gillian Rose and Alan Sekula once said that there are at least 2 kinds of discursive analysis around photographic archives. One that sees archives as part of a larger data set, the other that is interested in the effects of the archive on the meanings that they produce. I'm interested in both of these kinds of analysis. My research aims to explore both how and why new photographic forms and practices evolve, and what we can learn about the past by investigating the functions that photographic images serve when they are put into circulation. And this research has led me to investigate several historical sites where photographs circulated. I'll start with an example of a unique photographic archive that was conceived just a few miles from here. At NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab during the 1970s, a special photography experiment was launched. The Golden Record was a collection of sounds, diagrams, and images assembled for the Voyager 2 mission. The goal of the record was to create a representation of the human and natural environment on Earth. How did the idea of sending a photographic archive into space come about? The idea for it arose in 1971 as preparations were being made for the launch of the first space probe, Pioneer 10, that achieved escape velocity from the solar system. Its mission was to fly past Jupiter and send back the first close-up pictures of Jupiter on a flyby of the planet. But the slingshot effect of Jupiter's gravity meant it would achieve escape velocity from the sun and hurtle on into outer space. 2 LA-based science reporters suggested to astronomer Carl Sagan that Pioneer 10 should carry a message for aliens. Sagan loved the idea, which followed a tradition of buried time capsules, which seemed to begin in 1936 with a capsule stuffed with religious imagery. It was a nice idea, but it was also an absurd idea. The now iconic images were sketched onto gold anodized aluminum and placed on board the spacecraft. After NASA received criticism, the agency chose not to allow Sagan and his colleagues to include a photograph of a nude man and woman on the record. Instead, only a silhouette of a couple was included. This happened in the midst, of course, of the anti-pornography movement in the US. Sagan is said to have felt terrible that the figures depicted looked white, Caucasian. A cover story in a weekly Berkeley magazine printed an image of the plaque with the caption, "Hello, we're from Orange County." 4 years ago, NASA, or 4 years later, sorry, it was also kind of shades of Muybridge, so thinking about the frontier and these kind of concerns about nudity going into space. So 4 years later, NASA approached Sagan to make another plaque, this time for Voyager missions 1 and 2. This time, Sagan came up with the idea of making an LP record. Like the plaque, it was to be an etching on metal, but rather than pictures, the LP would contain waveforms. Low-resolution images would be encoded as a video signal and etched in a similar manner. The team assembled 116 images and a variety of natural sounds, to which they added musical selections from different cultures and spoken greetings. Their ambition was to, quote, give a full picture of Earth and its inhabitants, unquote. The committee steered away from anything controversial, war, disease, crime, poverty. They avoided photographs of nuclear war, of nuclear explosion. They avoided any political statement or images that might seem hostile to recipients. For it wasn't a documentary, it was a picture postcard, a vision of a harmonious and multicultural planet to which Sagan and team imagined humanity should aspire. The final selection was a melange of 1970s scientific and earlier scientific and popular photographic visual culture, a selection from Edward Steichen's 1955 Museum of Modern Art exhibition of the family of man, National Geographic illustrations, scientific photos, DNA, human anatomy, the planets, animals, and photos that came from the United Nations, among others. One of the strangest images was a photograph that the team shot themselves when they were unable to find an image that clearly showed what they wanted to explain. This is a demonstration of eating, licking, and drinking fabricated for the Golden Record. Audience reactions were mixed. Artist Connie Samaras quoted Walter Benjamin's observation that, quote, there is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism, unquote. Concerns were also raised about whether alien beings would understand pictures. There were no images of artworks included. As one of Sagan's team explained, this was because they thought extraterrestrials would have enough trouble interpreting photographs of reality or simple diagrams without including a photograph of a painting, which is itself an interpretation of reality. As the team pointed out, they didn't even know if aliens had eyes. But was it even possible to compose a message for extraterrestrials with the stated goals of the Golden Record, a full picture of Earth and its inhabitants? Of course not. The Golden Record was, on its face, a double failure. One, it seemed unlikely to reach its intended audience, and two, if it did, it wouldn't accomplish what it set out to do, to represent humanity. But I think in this example, we see some of the paradoxes and contradictions that have long confounded work in photographic archives and that are part of the project of them. I'm going to turn now to identify some general conclusions, things that we think we agree about in some of these conversations. Some of the things that we think we agree or know already about photographic archives. The historian Peter Burke judged that, quote, relatively few historians work in photographic archives. By any measure, things have changed a lot since that assessment in 2000. Today, thousands of people around the world work in some capacity in or with photographic archives, from conservators, archivists, and art historians to students of visual anthropology, activists, historians, barristers. The way in which photographs are collected and exhibited has potentially far-reaching effects for how we actually understand the past. 3, we agree that photographic archives are not neutral guardians of memory, and also that there is a need for more critical awareness about how archives wield their power to structure photographic documents for historical research. We know that photographic collections can be classified in a number of different ways, but also that because it's impossible for libraries and museums to catalog every single photograph in collections running to billions and billions now, potentially, there is a need for devising classification systems that are capable of expansion. We also agree that much is at stake, or there's broad agreement, that decisions and choices about what is a photographic archive as opposed to, say, a miscellaneous collection are critical. Photographs are recognized as valuable archives in themselves. With the passage of time, all or most or many photographic collections could acquire an archival interest for students and historians. What we do not all agree on, I'm just kind of throwing these out, so maybe we all agree on these, I don't know. What is a photographic archive and what photographic archives are for? How to make the best uses of photographic collections? Which category of photographs should take priority? How best to digitize collections so they don't lose their historical material value? Things that we don't know. Sorry, this print's probably kind of small. We know remarkably little about the history of the practice of photographic collecting itself. We know very little about the present users of photographic archives, and we know little or almost nothing about how or why they'll be used in the future. What is the right balance? What the right balance should be between conservation and demands for access? How changes in libraries more generally are going to affect the future of photographic archives? Okay, now I'm going to try some things that what we think we know but might be wrong. One, that museums and libraries may fairly be described as regimes of truth, to use Foucault's, to use the phrase that's often used in connection with archives. In fact, while there is some truth to this notion, in fact, archivists and curators who operate behind institutions, in institutions, often through no fault of their own, in many cases are constrained in knowing what precisely their archives hold in terms of numbers, subject matter, format, antiquity, and the like. 2, that digitizing photographs solves the problem of access and distribution. At the same time, as we've heard, it also can create some new problems. Another thing that we often hear, but that's important to kind of query, is that all photographs are important to store and to circulate and save. In fact, there are many photographs that people don't want stored or easily available. If we think about facial images, religious and cultural beliefs, governments, activists, privacy, those kinds of issues, how will those issues be resolved in the interplay between economics, law, and politics, commercial archives, and what is the role of the historian in all of that? I think the other thing that, maybe I think that students, and the idea that what happens in the photographic archives in our own institutions and other institutions, that it doesn't really affect us as scholars and teachers. Scholars and universities could do a lot more to foster closer relations with and support dialogue about photographic collections in our own libraries and museums and with our students. The Black Lives Matter campaign, where did my image go? I must have, well, I was supposed to have an image up there of some of the imagery around the Black Lives Matter campaign last year. Many of you who work on college campuses know that this was a year where there was also a lot of protest movement on campus. And what we found was that, or I found, teaching, is that the Black Lives Matter campaign on our campus provided an opening for students and professors to talk about the changing role of photography in the history of social protest movements and the importance of archiving this history. I'll now talk about some specific examples from my own archival research, which has extended across a variety of different kinds of archives. As Jenny said, I recently finished researching and writing a book manuscript about the Tichborne trial in the Victorian visual imagination. The celebrated trial of the Tichborne claimant, which was a case that extended over 7 years between 1867 and 1874, was a case of identity and impersonation that was shaped from the beginning by photography and its mechanical reproduction and circulation. At the center of the trial was the figure of this man, shown here in the first photograph that we have of him, taken in Wagga Wagga, Australia, where he was working as a butcher. He came to London from Australia in 1866, claiming to be Sir Roger Tichborne, the long-lost and presumed drowned heir to one of England's oldest aristocratic estates. The drowned heir is shown here in the only known 2 images of him based on daguerreotypes made of him in Santiago, Chile in 1853. I was thinking about yesterday when we saw the photograph of Bayard's photograph of the drowned man, which also generated a lot of discussion about authenticity. The claimant's arrival into London in 1866 and his gambit to establish himself as a long-lost baronet created a huge sensation in the country and around the world. This engraving from the Figaro depicted him emerging from the Thames with the ocean providing a crucial natural barrier between a mysterious past and an uncertain future. In fact, the court determined he was really Arthur Orton, the son of a butcher from East London. This is an autotype photograph where the heads of the different participants are pasted into this image. This dates from 1873. The case became the first in modern history in which photography and the court's handling of photographic evidence were publicly debated to this extent. My research has uncovered hundreds of photos and other representations, engravings, lithographs, waxwork, ceramics, newspaper illustrations, courtroom sketches related to this Tichborne case. These circulated in a wide variety of different spaces and across a tremendous diversity of Victorian media across a wide social spectrum. I conducted research in archives across 4 continents, including Australia, Europe, the Americas, and Southeast Asia, looking at scrapbooks, legal correspondence, detective organizations, newspapers, newspaper libraries, copyright registers, photographic trade magazines, state libraries, private collections, and others. The book has 3 primary aims. The first is showing how and why the case sparked judicial reforms during an age of widening democratic franchise, imperial expansion, and growing expectations about access to the judicial process. The second is to delve into the details of that legal process, which so fascinated the British public during the 19th century. The third is addressing how visual democracy and visual dissent, were functioning in new ways in the 1860s and 70s, which was a period that, as Marnie just said, was one that in many ways prefigures the age we're in now. The Tichborne trial was not just the trial of the century, it was the first major court case after the invention of photography and the rise of mass visual culture to engage a broad spectrum of society about questions of identity and identification. The development of modern mass politics called into being new ways of using and thinking about visual images. Changes in visual culture offered new forms of political speech and communication. I'm just going to show some of the kinds of objects that I've been looking at. This is a cabinet photograph that was made of 4 photographs from the life of the claimant, and it includes the three of them which he sat for and paid for. The other one was one that he was done by the London Stereoscopic Committee. But he was, the first 2 were made in Australia. When these are aspirational photographs, he sends to this grieving mother to say, this is what, here he is, he's found in Australia. There are also objects like, the one on the left is a Westminster play. There are a number of examples of photographs where the heads of the participants were cut out and put over scenes from, in this case, Henry II, Part 4, and also lots and lots of scrapbooks and photo albums where people are playing with the pictures in these. For those of you who are counting, this is the second work we've seen at this conference of a 16th century photographer. I think Costanza Carafa also showed us the first one. Examples of these lithographic plates. Okay, this is the photograph I want to talk about here. This photograph, made about 1873, shows the court documents piled up on a chair, copyrighted by the newly created London Photographic and Stereo Company. And actually, speaking of collections, this collection was collected by Brian May, the guitarist for Queen, the music group, who also in the 1970s was starting, I think in the 1970s, was starting to collect that material. So copyrighted by the London Stereo Company and serving to promote its work, it was widely circulated in London and shows up in many photo albums. It functions simultaneously as a visual argument for photography's importance in the mechanical production of material forms of evidence, and as an important means for representing in a popular format for mass audiences the significance of documents, the role of photography in producing written documents. It also exhibits the challenge of depicting pictorially the labor involved in interpreting documents and visual evidence. The use of photographic portraits in the trial, shown draped over the documents. Well, you can see them. Okay, I'm not working very well. Shown draped over the documents was almost as noteworthy as the imposture intrigue. This brought new meaning to Jeremy Bentham's phrase, "Justice must be seen to be done," or a phrase popularized by Bentham. This is one of 4 surviving red leather photo wallets that was prepared by the commission appointed by the court to send barristers for both sides around the world, photographs in hand, to gather testimony from prospective witnesses in Chile and Australia before the trial began. Each holds 6 cabinet-sized photos of Tichborne and the claimant, serving as a kind of portable archive. So it's just an example of archives that are moving. Among the people the commission agents interviewed about these photos were many we don't hear about very much in the history of photography: shepherds, sailors, cattle rustlers, domestic servants, military officers, tourists, gardeners, and itinerant photographers living in the outposts of the colonies. These written records provide a rare resource for reconstructing the reception of photographic portraiture beyond a handful of elites, and show how the same set of photographs could evoke different emotional responses, including laughter, remonstration, skepticism, and others. I'm now researching a new book about the history of facial recognition systems and photographic detection and evasion, and helping organize a conference at Birkbeck this July on photography, law, and facial images. The aim is to show how humanities can shed light on current controversies over the expansion of biometrics to the longer cultural history of resemblance in photographic portraiture. I'm also co-editing a book of case laws about photography's entanglements with Anglo-American law, from the invention of photography in 1839 to contemporary legal debates. And this is with Jennifer Mnookin, who's Dean of Law at UCLA Law School. And we've pulled together some of the many cases around 4 main areas: privacy, content, intellectual property, and evidence, to use as a teaching resource to bring these materials together. There's a staggering variety of photographic collections and therefore of the practices needed to access and interpret them. And this is particularly true when we consider photo archives that are maybe not some of the ones that were, they're outside of Europe and the US, and actually within Europe and the US and some of the smaller libraries. And I've just included here a range of different examples of different ways that people obviously look at photographic archives. Conventional methods of training in my discipline of history don't necessarily prepare future students for using these archives. Aside from the question of digitization there, we need to be also giving a lot more thought to how students are being trained in history to make meaningful sense of the rich collections that we have. Not to mention encouraging them to save the ones that, to kind of donate their collections or be aware of their historical preservation. And it's also good remembering that many researchers are not just conducting research in one kind of archive, but using a lot of the different kinds at the same time. To come back to a point that Costanza Carafa made yesterday, it's so important to remember that we don't know how future researchers will use this material. Curators who hung on to picture libraries for decades before the rise of photography studies during the 1970s helped us see why they're valuable just as much as academic scholars did. How people see and use images change over time. We heard yesterday from Paul Conway about a taxonomy of photography users, and it might sound new, but it's really in the 19th century too. People also came up with classifications of makers and users of photos, and often how people used those photos, how people thought about the user of photo then had significant implications for the classifications and after that. Oh, here it is. I just got the slide in the wrong place. All right, sorry. So this is going back to just talking about how I found on my campus that talking about photography and the technological transformation of social protest was a way to really, engage students, and I'm a British historian, so we talked about surveillance and photography and social movements, and learned a lot from the students. And also we worked with the library so that some of their visual materials, so that they understood, they also understood, and they were aware that that there's historical importance to the materials that they were using in their campaign, because they've studied photography and social movements in classes, in history classes. So anyway. Last year I began a new project, Science Against Industry, which is a study of the Victorian alkali industry and the passage of new laws affecting the regulation of industrial river pollution. This project recovers the origin of several photographic albums of industrial waste that were introduced into evidence in Britain's earliest river and air pollution prevention cases. These were some of the world's, maybe the world's first air and river pollution cases. The photos I've found so far in pollution albums were taken by both amateurs and professional photographers. And just to give you an example of some of them, I'm just starting to do research on them. They're pretty badly deteriorated. These photographs are from an album discovered that was in a locked bell tower in Widnes. Widnes is a town outside of Manchester. It was really the first chemical town for the alkali industry. A lot of the photographs, these were for the alkali inspector. Many of the photographs that the chemical company had were thrown out when the alkali industry closed. They're not beautiful images. These are in deteriorating condition anyway. They're unlikely to be exhibited anytime soon, but they're extremely important ones for historians, because they're among the first examples of how environmental law was to become an image-based aspect of the law, not just a word-based one. So they're really kind of quite critical images in some ways. And it's not only chemical companies that throw away images, of course, colleges and universities, we all do. I mean, that's what happens. And so, a lot of my research in archives is like trying to find them. In Let the Microscope Tell Your Story was a project I undertook about Philip Gravel, who was an American chemist who developed the comparison microscope for use in the identification of bullets fired in crimes. He was also a prominent nature photographer, the first non-English scientist to win in 1923 the prestigious Barnard Medal awarded by the London Photographic Society for photomicrography. His photos of subvisual phenomena, some of which are shown here, graced the pages of America's glossy magazines and corporate print advertisements in the 1920s and 30s. These photographs, some of these photographs are from the Staten Island Historical Museum, which I just had kind of stumbled on. I wasn't really looking for those, but I was looking for something else and saw these. These photographs cross genres of science and commerce, commercial advertisement, and criminal forensics, practical domains that historians usually study separately if they study them at all. Archivists and archives can help signpoint these connections and make them visible when historians do not. And I liked Tracy Schuster's example yesterday when she mentioned that of the Getty's idea of reuniting some of the photo collections with the paper collections, and how that might generate some conversations about the photographs that might not otherwise happen. So just to conclude, what are some of the common characteristics of the archives that I use? They tend to be ephemeral. They tend to not be so much part of an existing archive. A lot of it's just trying to find where they are. I'm very conscious of the boundary between the archive and the library and the collection. It's also, when you're a historian doing this work, you're like a patron of lost causes. So that's a lot of these kind of materials, you kind of like to have the problem of whether it's going to be digital or print. And just by way, as historian Raphael Samuel once noted in a classic essay, The Eye of History, history was recognized during the 19th century as something not belonging solely to experts, but rather made by and belonging to ordinary people. Indeed, photographic material survives today in large part because contemporaries thought it should be preserved for posterity. In a similar way, their collection is not simply about the preservation of the past, sort of looking back and nostalgic and just hanging on to these things, but really about a hope about the future. And I think this recalls the spirit of the Golden Record. In the future, historians who are attuned to thinking with an archival logic, rather than only seeking out outstanding photographers or great single images that appeal to contemporary taste, will challenge the way we think and understand photography and its dominant uses in each historical period, and be truly responsible to multiple conditions and voices and contexts of production. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Again, a really rich talk, and I love to see the incredible range of archives, and I'll put that in quotation marks because some aren't truly archives as we think of them. And I wondered, we'll open it up to questions, but I wonder how much you as a historian going into these archives think about the intentionality of the person that created that archive, if that factors in from the get-go. I mean, it's hard to know in some cases, but we've talked a lot here about intentionality, about the fact that a lot of that kind of intention is being in the process of being erased, or maybe not even known. But I wonder about that for you, the intention of the person who put the archive together.
Yeah, I think, can you hear me without it, or is it better, it's better with it? I do think about the intentionality of the archive, as well as trying to think about who made the photograph. And sometimes it's clear, if some of the objects are in legal archives, with the case I just finished, some of them are in the crime section, others are pasted into scrapbooks. So I would be interested in finding out, if I could, what other kinds of images were in that scrapbook. I mean, I looked at about 20 different scrapbooks of this trial. So I was interested in how people kind of followed the trial, what kind of narratives they seem to be putting together in the kind of objects that they assembled. So not just looking at how they looked at the trial, but other kind of subjects that they were interested in, other kinds of celebrities. So in a lot of the archives that I look in, actually, it may be, I think from listening to some of the papers, it may be that it may be more straightforward in some of the archives that I work in, where often they're coming in as part of state records, or and so on. And maybe the fact that they've been neglected. Often there's a lot of information that's connected to them that hasn't been. I mean, as I was listening to some of I think some of maybe there's something to be said for keeping a lot of this, for some of this information being like not of interest to a lot of people because it hasn't been disassembled.
Oh yeah, that's true. Questions from anybody? Yeah, Joan.
Maybe it's a bit more of a comment, but it ties back to Marnie's talk as well, is the idea of intentionality and how we've lost the battle. Marnie and I were at a conference in Denmark many years ago, and I sat beside an earnest young man at dinner from an English department. And he asked me what I did. I told him I was an archivist and tried to keep intention and context. And he said, oh no, we don't do that anymore. Reception theory has taken over, and I wonder to what extent it's not just digitization, but part of the battle was lost when literary theory came along and declared the death of the author, and really it doesn't matter, and it's all about, Elvis has left the building. We're worrying about what's out there as opposed to what created it in the first place, what does it reflect about the society in which it initially circulated. So I think that that's the other side of the digital death knell, is that the reception theory side has killed intention. I just wonder what...
I think for me, in thinking about, so in history, one of the areas that I've been really interested in is some of the work that's been done on convergence, on looking at the ways in which we can look at reception in ways that don't just require, someone saying, I looked at this picture and this is what I thought about it, but looking at how some of the images get reappropriated and reused in other kinds of visual forms. So for me, when I started that other project, one reason why this Tichborne project took me a long time was I started it as a photography project, and then I began to realize, well, people were pasting photographic heads onto engraving, lithographs. I mean, there was such an interplay. There were 3 fine, oil paintings that seemed to be based a lot on news illustrations, which were also based on photographs. So I think this particular period I work on, there's a lot of excitement about the novelty of visual culture and thinking about how people are going to use it. It's being used to, it's being used by the state in some ways, frightening ways. I think for historians, I work on that one project is about someone who was whose own authenticity was being questioned. So one question for me came up was, how would I tell the story if we thought he was real, if he was the baronet in Australia versus not? And so that would change the way we would understand the intentionality of his sitting for that picture. I mean, was he trying to look like an English baronet, or was he just being, he just had been in Australia for a long time, and he didn't feel like he had to improve his appearance. So I think, I don't know if I'm not really answering your question, but I think as a historian, we have to think about what's available to the people at the time in terms of what they, what were some of the possibilities for intention. But I think literary. I think there's a lot of really great work on reception that doesn't require denying the death of the author or whatever. Yeah.
Well, I think Costanza. Okay, and then we'll break for a coffee.
Well, I also have a comment on this. I don't think that we have lost the battle. We are still fighting, I really agree with you that it is not for the past; it is for the future that we want to preserve this and study these documents. And my dream is that the post-digital environment allows us to think about media, analog photographs, digital photographs, and so on, from with an historical gaze, from a scholarly point of view, and that we can give up the ideology of digitization. Mm-hmm. We all do digitize in our collections. It is obvious. We don't have to underline it as it was 10 years ago, maybe. And indeed, there are many problems that we don't get enough money for our digitization projects. It is an absurdity of the situation, but it is like this. And on the other side, that the digital era allowed distance from the analog photography that helped to develop a historical gaze on photographs. And so there are many aspects that cannot be reduced to a formula, and I hope that we are here also at the end to overcome the analog-digital divide and to think in another way, both about analog and digital, and in fact also about digital materiality. This would be the next challenge in my eyes. Digital is by no means immaterial. You just have to think about digital rubbish that is a big issue, or a digital ecology and something like that. So my hope is that also through this kind of scholarly meeting we can overcome this contraposition that in fact shapes our everyday life, and try to develop strategies that go beyond this.
Can I just say one thing in response to that? Is that I think that is, I think for a historian, I think it varies depending on which field you are, which things people are anxious about. I think one of the things that Marnie was saying was that a lot of the bad habits of historians are reinforced by the digitization. So it's not that it's a worry that maybe other people in other fields might need to worry about, but for us, because this is also, it's not the only factor, but that I think that the analog digital question has, I think there are questions about what is the image of the past that's gonna circle on. I mean, if we think about optimistically, maybe the iconic images will become so expensive that that the people will start working on the images of the past that have been more or less not well studied, which is about 99.9% of the photographs out there. So that may be one silver lining.
Thank you very much, Jennifer.